If people come to me and ask me advice about Yiquan, one of the first things that I very often do, if they've already got a background in Chinese martial arts, is set this conceptual puzzle of looking at the standard holding the ball posture and then looking at the second basic posture where we take a step forward and the arms are still in that holding the ball posture, but we've skewed the posture into what's normally called the fight-based stance, or the jiji-zhuang. And of course the holding the ball posture is usually described as a health-based posture. And what I do is I ask people, why? Why is one health-based and why is one fight-based? And the basis for asking that is that it's absolutely not as simple as it seems, but most people will come back immediately and say, well, if you're standing side on, that's better for combat, you're hiding parts of your body mass. And also the nature and structure of the posture allows you to generate force a little bit more easily. And that's a perfectly reasonable answer. The only problem with that is, if you think about it a little bit more, that might explain something about the fight-based posture, but it doesn't explain at all why standing straight on would be better for health. And that's why in a previous instalment I've highlighted this often unconsidered, unspoken ideology that balance is healthy. There's a semiotic relationship between balance and the idea of health, and people just assume, well, if you're balanced in your posture, then that must be better for health. But there's very rarely any kind of rationale for that when you actually ask people explicitly to explain why. Also, if you're sparring or doing sport fighting, not to mention being in a real fight, you find yourself in all kinds of positions, side on, flat on your back getting a kick in. Been there a couple of times myself, and in every which way you can imagine. So we might have the template posture of being side on, but in reality for combat we also need to be able to utilise and hit from multiple different stances and angles. But the subtext of what I'm doing when I ask that question is trying to find out what kind of learner someone is. And there are different kinds of learners, and it doesn't really matter what kind of learner somebody is. What matters most of all is what kind of coach the coach is. Some learners can work exceptionally well with concepts, and Wang Shenjai talks about this idea of the perfect student, who's not just someone who trains really hard, someone who gets it physically, but someone who gets it conceptually. And he says this is the kind of student where you begin to explain something and they finish the sentence for you because they just get it, they're just on the same wavelength. Other kinds of students can't necessarily work with concepts in that way, but they can work physically. So they can learn from looking at postures, following postures, working with the coach, feeling things dynamically as physical knowledge. And then there's all different kinds of coaches from one extreme to the other, and everything in between just the same. What matters is people who can link it all together in a way that leads to the practical outcomes in the end. But remember this key idea that I keep getting across, that each one is a social project as well as a personal project. So your personal learning style and each one as a social project are two different things. Your personal learning style feeds into the social project, but the social project contains everything. And avoiding a big preamble, I'll just say that we've got lots of practical stuff to look at that builds on the standing pole practice we've been doing so far. So we're going to move on into looking at lots of practical martial arts stuff, but there's important conceptual upgrades that we need before then. And we can call this the logical model of each one, which I'll explain in a moment. And this is going to contain some actually quite simple ideas that then help everyone. Whether you're a physical learner, it will help you calculate and solve problems. For example, if you're thinking, well, in each one, how do I use a lead elbow? Or as a social project for each one, what's the best way to do a lead elbow in a given set of circumstances? So we're going to look at how the logical model helps us understand how to do that, how to solve those problems on our own. So particularly if you're not working with another person who's showing you directly, the logical model can be really, really helpful. And if you are someone who can work very effectively with concepts, that's very useful. But even if not, the essentials of the logical model are so practical, they're so user-friendly and so useful, they just radically transform the rate and degree of your progression. But before we get there, I wanted to give a quote from Han Huang, and this is in the context of these people. It's like a disease that spread into Yiquan, and Han Huang himself calls it something like a disease, where Zhanzhuang ideation leads to people viewing Zhanzhuang standing pole as the only thing that you need to do, as Han Huang says, thinking that it will solve all your problems. So, of course, in an idiomatic sense, it's absolutely fine when people say, well, just practice standing and lots of things will correct themselves. I say that myself. Lots of things will correct themselves, but they won't correct themselves to the point where they start being practically useful in terms of combat. That's just ridiculous. So this is just an ideology that took off very much after Wang Xiangjia died, particularly in the Qigong craze that swept China in the 1980s. And don't forget, standing wasn't popularized through Yiquan, it was popularized through Falun Gong. And this idea of its omnicompetence in health matters, in martial arts, then spread rapidly. And all of a sudden you've got people who feel like they don't need to do any kind of actual practical training. So I want to just correct that first of all with this quote from Han Huang. And Han Huang says, quote, "Since Wang Xiangjia began popularizing the practices of Yiquan, he made numerous significant contributions to the world of Chinese martial arts. Many practitioners now commence with Zhanzhuang and so have seen their strength improve remarkably and moreover quickly. However, more recently, some people have begun to believe that standing is the answer to all training requirements. Such an opinion is entirely wrong. Zhanzhuang is extremely important, but if there is no training in actual movement, such as testing force, Fa Li, and boxing practice, then one's training entirely lacks any practical dimension regarding the use of the strength being developed. Considering correct wushu theory, we must say that any movement has various factors and so requires coordination. And movement coordination is obviously far more complicated than any basic zhuang. Therefore, to progress from relative stillness in Zhanzhuang to the ability of actual active use is not merely a matter of so-called morphological changes. To put things directly, the zhuang is mostly for training the coordination of one's strength, while the testing force, the exertion of power, combat training and so on, is the overall embodiment of that strength in coordinated movement. Of course, it is a fact that people who are well cultivated in Zhanzhuang can go on to grasp the fundamentals of combat movement under the guidance of correct training. Yet, Zhanzhuang cannot even replace testing force, let alone be a replacement for use of power and practical boxing training. Without training using movements, you will never achieve an appreciation of the dialectical relationship between action and cultivated strength. I have seen many examples of this. Some people can feel the contradictory tensions when in Zhanzhuang, but they cannot express this when they begin to move. Their understanding of contradictory forces is left behind, and they cannot express real strength in movement. This is another important reason why some people stagnate for a long time and simply cannot improve their boxing." End quote. I mean, personally, I'd go further than that, and I have done before. I think because of improvements in Yiquan training, lots of people now can extend the correct feeling of contradictory force into movement. It's just that the problem then moves forward a stage. So we've got that stage pushed forward, but then the amount of people who can transition from that stage into practical application is negligible. But that's the project we're working on here, so keep working towards it. We can eventually help people get to that point. So that being said, let's move on to a different quote from Han Huang, and this time he's talking about the opposite kind of person, the person who has made it, the person who has become a serious Yiquan master, what he calls a mature boxer, but he doesn't mean mature necessarily in terms of age, mature in skill level. And about this level, Han Huang says, quote, "This is the stage when the boxer is mature. He must discuss the strategies and tactics of boxing in depth. He must carefully summarise the previous forms of boxing and combine what is learned with his own efforts in studying the theoretical problems of boxing. He must work independently to uncover shortcomings and to propose solutions, and what's more, to formulate a training method for their fulfilment. In this stage, Whether or not you can discover the laws of boxing is not something that just happens. It is the result of a combination of theory and practice, enabling you to put forward your own views. This is what determines the level of achievement of a boxing practitioner's life." End quote. So what Hansi Huang is describing here is a practical, creative ability to engage problems and solve them yourselves based on your understanding of Wushu theory and the knowledge of previous generations of martial arts practitioners. And to understand some of the differences between that way of looking at it and the way that we're often told to look at it in Chinese martial arts, I want to compare it a little bit with mathematics. So think of mathematics as a system, something that has a certain internal logic to it, and once you understand the principles of mathematics, you can then continually expand along its infinite curriculum. It has a logical structure to it, a logical model based on first axioms, and if you have those first axioms, you might not necessarily know all the advanced stuff, the advanced mathematics that's going to be developed thousands of years later, but nevertheless the seeds are contained within it. It has an infinite curriculum. And this radical way of looking at Yiquan, which is the way that Wang Xiangjia looks at it, is so contradictory to the way that we normally made to think about Chinese martial arts. And to explain that, think about the ancient Greek mathematician Euclid. He wanted to write a textbook on mathematics, and for us in the modern world, it probably seems completely obvious how you would do that. You would have some kind of introductory chapter, maybe you'll mention a few people like Euclid, a few famous mathematicians, but then you would rapidly move on to explaining the basics. What is a number? The functions used in mathematics, addition, subtraction, division, and so on, and then you would unfold the logical model of mathematics. But Euclid lived within a completely different cultural paradigm where that wasn't obvious at all. In Euclid's time, the biography of a famous scholar was equally as important as any ideas that they developed. When they lived, how they died, any famous stories about them, any anecdotes, all of these things were wrapped up together with the ideas that they brought into the world. And linked into that, the personas of these famous scholars then founded schools and traditions, and people drew their legitimacy from their relationship to a lineage to these famous scholars. And you can see this is an absolute exact parallel to the world of Chinese martial arts as we're usually made to understand it. But Euclid then realises there's enormous problems with this. For one thing, it's going to be a work that's so enormous, it's going to completely swamp out his idea, which was to teach people mathematics through a book. And secondly, the way that things were invented in mathematics wasn't logical. Somebody discovered one thing at one point in time, 100 years later, someone discovers something else. That makes something that someone discovered 50 years previously make sense. It's higgledy-piggledy. There's no logical structure when you follow a biographical model like that. It makes it incredibly difficult for people to learn mathematics because they've got to try and put all those pieces together by following the story in real time. So Euclid has this revolutionary idea of separating biographies from the logic of mathematics itself. They're two different subjects. The history of mathematics is one subject. Mathematics itself as a logical system is an entirely different subject. So you leave the biographies aside. They're interesting, but they're not that relevant for teaching people mathematics itself. And instead, you present a logical system. And this is what he does. He starts with first principles, axioms of mathematics, and then he builds them up into a logical model, the implications of those axioms and how they then unfold in the infinite curriculum of mathematics. But look at what we've got in Chinese martial arts. We've got the biographical model. Tons and tons of information, which is really interesting. I'm as interested in it as anyone else about people, their lifetimes, and that gets mixed up with what they discovered, and then that's passed down into the next generation, and then we learn about the next generation and any additions that they made and so on, and we learn all about their lives and all these folk tales and stories that grow bigger in the telling, and eventually everything starts getting lost. As Professor Jing Yuan, who I've mentioned before, says in his work on Yiquan, the actual really important creative elements of Yiquan get drowned out very often, not just by biographies, but by biographies that aren't even true. And the next thing I have to say, I've really had a long think about, not because I'm frightened of the person I'm talking about, I couldn't care less about them, but because Wang Xiangjia said try your best not to speak too harshly about people, and I am trying, but there are certain things that are so corrupt and so in the wrong direction that if we don't challenge them, then we can't make the breakthrough into the positive direction. And what I mean is, I want to use this as an example of this biographical model that people use and why it's so corrupt and why it's a control tactic. So there's a website, and on that website you can buy t-shirts that say things like Invincible Crushing Fist of Guo Yun Shen, and also on that website you can buy online video courses to learn Xing Yiquan and Bagua, and you can also buy a book with the same person's interpretations of Xing Yiquan classics. What you can't do, amongst all those hundreds of videos and books and t-shirts and posters and all the other merch that they are exploiting the reputations of other real fighters to make money for themselves, what you can't find is a single example of that person using their Bagua or Xing Yiquan in any kind of live environment, punching anything but the air or doing anything but arm locking someone who just stands there like a dummy. And as I've said before, there's only one reason why that happens, and that's because they can't do it. For those people, they would give their left arm to be able to put out a video of them using the thing that they're teaching practically. They absolutely would if they could. The only reason that they don't is because they can't. So all of this stuff, which is advertised as learn real Kung Fu, all of it is based on the exploitation of the lineage model, the exploitation of other people. And moreover, as Wang Xiangjia himself says, even if you can do it, you can't necessarily explain it. But if you can't do it, then you absolutely can't explain it. So how can someone in that position then write a book interpreting the Xing Yiquan classics, for example? They can't. All they can do is this absolutely classic thing of reinterpreting information so that it matches their own limitations. And Wang Xiangjia himself tells us this is how Chinese martial arts ultimately degrades into obsolescence. But what permits that to carry on is the adherence to the lineage model. The idea that there's some kind of knowledge that's passed down, and they are the gateway to it. At all points, they are the gateway to it. Is the foot slightly this way or is it slightly that way? The only reason why it's this way is because I say so as the guru, and this comes from the secret knowledge of my tradition. Imagine if this was mathematics and someone was saying, well, 4 plus 4 equals 53. 10 minus 2 equals 78. And the basis for that is, well, that's what's taught in our lineage. That's the authentic, basic knowledge of our lineage. And that would be nonsense, of course, but compare that to a different kind of learning where you're taught the logical system of mathematics itself so you can work it out for yourself. That way of thinking breaks the mold, just like Euclid broke the mold, just like Wang Xiangjia broke the mold. In mathematics, you can't get away with it. Well, okay, you can to some degree. There's been charlatans in mathematics and physics particularly, but to a massive degree you can't really get away with it because people can access the infinite curriculum of mathematics themselves using a few basic tools. That's what Wang Xiangjia wanted for Chinese martial arts. Once we have the basic principles, the basic axioms, then we can start working it out for ourselves, seeing what's right and seeing what's wrong ourselves. We don't need any guru to go through to get to that knowledge. At the end of the day, you're designed in the context of the laws of physics. So this thing people do, I always give this great example of, for martial artists, you develop really good reactions. So long-term martial artists will have experienced this thing where you open a cupboard and something falls out and you catch it, and other people are like, wow, your reactions are amazing. And it's not really that your reactions are amazing, it's just that everyone else's reactions are really dulled through socialization, as Wang Xiangjia himself points out. You're designed, everybody is designed in the reality of gravity, so you are designed to work at that speed. It's your natural biological inheritance to be able to just catch something that's falling at the speed of gravity. You evolved within that context. And this is why in Yiquan we don't say you learn Yiquan, we say that you unfold Yiquan. You unfold it. And this links directly to this idea that Wang Xiangjia talks about of proceeding through intuition. So what kind of learner are you? One way or the other, you have to use intuition. And this then opens up a whole other doorway of what we mean by intuitive training. So I want you to think about how real lineage works in Yiquan, this idea of negative lineage. And don't worry, we're going to come back to this idea of the logical model of Yiquan. We'll probably do a few sessions on that where we unfold it, and that's going to also help us go back to this idea of the difference between health and so-called combat posture, and why there isn't really a difference. The whole point of this session is to set that up, to set up that understanding and that discussion. So think about negative lineage. Each generation should be getting better than the previous generation. And think about that in terms of mathematics, by the way. Think about the very first person who started to use formal mathematics and how little they actually knew. And yet, within that little that they knew, the seeds, the gateway, the key to open the door into the infinite curriculum of mathematics was contained within that absolutely most basic level of knowledge. Now, as a comparison, let's think about the first master of Yiquan. Not Wang Xiangjai, but the first person in history who began to combine elements of stillness training with martial arts training. Symbolically, Wang Xiangjai says that this is Dharmo at Shaolin, but we know that most of Wang Xiangjai's students extend that time frame significantly further back into the Taoist masters of the distant past of ancient China. And we like to think that that person had it all, that they are the supreme level master, because as Wang Xiangjai's student Zhao Daoxin says, as we mentioned in a previous instalment, people tend to worship the past. People tend to think, particularly in Chinese martial arts, the further back you go, the higher the level. But Yiquan's reverse lineage concept doesn't work like that. Just like in mathematics, the further back you go, the less they know. And also, just like in mathematics, those people in the past are individuals, so they have individual levels of knowledge, but they're also part of a social project, and there's an overall level of social understanding of mathematics at any particular point. And I should also say that just because someone knows less in the past doesn't mean that they're not brilliant. Euclid was brilliant. He had to build on and take further the knowledge that he was given in his time. Any modern mathematician who was born at the same time as Euclid would have had to have done the same, obviously. It seems obvious, but why don't we apply that idea to Chinese martial arts? Well, in Yiquan we do. So think about that first master. Their level of knowledge was limited by the time that they lived in. Everyone relies on being part of this social project. Unfolding the most basic, elementary elements of Yiquan would have taken an entire lifetime for that first master. And even then, if they unfold some of the basic principles, nevertheless, in the future, someone else might think of something else that then causes us to go back and revise those basic principles and think about them in a different way. So think, for example, something like using short, sharp movements. That's got to be conceptually developed based on a thought that someone's had about a requirement in the reality of a fight. And maybe they think, well, particularly if you're using a heavy weapon, is there a better way of using a heavy weapon than just swinging it? Well, what if I develop a way where I can use shorter but powerful movements and then I can cut out the swing? So you begin working on that. Maybe that takes a different master a lifetime just to flesh out the basics of that. And then 500 years later, someone else discovers that, well, actually, if you train in this particular way, you can involve more of your whole body strength within that short, sharp movement. And then maybe once they've developed that idea, then they go back and think, well, this thing that someone was talking about in this book that's 1,000 years old, that would link into this. So it's higgledy-piggledy, just like mathematics. It's not linear. It's an ongoing social process. And the reason to emphasize that is just to challenge this thing where people are saying, just do standing. Just do standing and you can just get everything. You can't. You will put yourself in the position of being the first master, and you'll only be able to provide the first master's explanation. That is, if you're really, really lucky, because the first master probably was a soldier or a wrestler, probably had significantly more practical experience of violence than most people now. So if you try and reinvent the wheel from scratch just through standing, through not engaging with concepts, with ideas, this utterly reactionary and in fact moronic cult of not thinking, there's only one reason why people would ever tell you not to think about what you're doing. To challenge that, we've got to remember this is a social project, and we can then link this into something that, well, I call it the last master's explanation. And by the last master, I don't mean any particular person. I mean each one is a social project. What's the final stage that we're going to reach, and what's the stage that we're at now? So wherever we're at now as a social project, wherever our understanding of the logical model is at any particular point, that's the last master's explanation. It's an organic, growing, problem-solving mapping of the infinite curriculum. And that's what we're going to move on to looking at next.